It's very limited. So it's kind of like having a contractor that only has one tool instead of 5 tools. And as we discussed earlier, I think they're applying those tools too late in the game.
How can you prove, let's start with exercise then. How can you prove to me that exercise is important?
Yeah, it's a great question. So start with, the easiest way to do this is to look at what the absence of exercise does versus looking at the absence or presence of other known bad things. Now, for me to explain this, I have to explain a technical term called a hazard ratio. So if you'll bear with me while I explain what a hazard ratio is, it will reap lots of fruit later on. A hazard ratio is a mathematical derivation that comes from looking at a group of people, following them prospectively, following them into the future, and looking at the rate at which they die. So a hazard ratio is a number. If that number is 1.5, it means that there's a 50% increase in the risk of death for one group versus the other. So for example, if we want to know, is smoking bad for you? We might ask the question, what is the hazard ratio for smokers to non-smokers when it comes to getting lung cancer?
Okay.
And the answer is like 10.
Really?
It's 10 times more, about 10 times more likely to get lung cancer if you're a smoker than if you're a non-smoker. Now, if you look at the hazard ratio across the course of life for all causes of death, it's about 1.5, meaning a smoker is about 50% more likely to die in any given year than a non-smoker.
Which you call all-cause mortality.
All-cause mortality is the gold standard for understanding death and disease because it takes into account every form of death.
Okay.
Okay. What if you have type 2 diabetes? Everybody understands that having type 2 diabetes is very problematic, and people with type 2 diabetes are at about twice the risk, more or less, of cancer, heart disease, maybe 1.5 times the risk of Alzheimer's disease. But when it comes to all-cause mortality, every cause of death, it's about a 1.4 hazard ratio.
40% more.
About a 40% increase in all-cause mortality. Again, that's a stark number. It means at any moment in time, if you take 2 people who are in otherwise always identical, but one has type 2 diabetes and one doesn't, this person has a 40% higher risk of dying in the coming year.
In the coming year?
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay. We could keep doing this. What if it's high blood pressure versus normal blood pressure? That's a hazard ratio of about 1.2. 20%, same, everything I just said, but it's 20%. Okay. What if it's someone who has end-stage kidney disease? Their kidneys don't work anymore. They're on dialysis, hanging by a thread, waiting for a kidney transplant. It's about 2.7. That's a 170% increase in all-cause mortality in the subsequent year. Okay. Now, let's talk about some other things. What if I ask the question, what happens if I take a group of 50-year-olds, pick any age, pick any sex, and we're going to take the top 15 to 20% in strength and compare them to the bottom 15 to 20% in strength for that age and sex? What's the difference? What's the hazard ratio there? What would your guess be?
20%? 10%?
Yeah, so 1.1 to 1.2?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's 3.
Shit.
200% difference in all-cause mortality.
Can you make a distinction between strength and muscle mass?
Okay. Yep, we can do it. So muscle mass, just if we did it just on muscle mass, it's about 2, or a 100% difference. So muscle mass turns out to be an amazing proxy for strength, but strength is even better.
Okay.
Yep. So high strength and high muscle mass produce a hazard ratio of about 3.5.
Okay. Because you can have a lot of muscles but not be strong.
Yeah.
Kind of.
And you can be strong and have not as much muscle.
Okay.
And that matters more, by the way.
Okay.
But they're pretty tightly correlated.
Okay. Cool.
Yep. Now let's look at VO2 max. So VO2 max is the best tool we have to measure peak cardiorespiratory fitness. So this is a test that you actually have to take. It's It's done on a treadmill or on a bike. They put a mask on your face, and then the mask measures how much oxygen you use. So in the book, I talk in great detail about this test. It's something anybody can do. It costs probably £100. It's not like super expensive. And everybody should know their VO2 max. I really think everybody should know it. And in the book, I even offer some ways that you can estimate it just by running at a track or something like that. So,
sorry, it's the measure of how much oxygen you're inhaling and exhaling? Or?
No, yeah. It's the difference between how much you inhale and exhale is how much you're using. So
okay.
the way the test is working is there's a little oxygen sensor. So if you're breathing in, we know that the air you're breathing in is 21% oxygen, and we know the flow rate. And let's just say you're blowing it out at 14%. So we know you used up 7% times the flow rate. We figure out how many liters per minute of oxygen you're using at the max.
And what's good and what's bad?
Yeah. So it depends on your age and sex. But at your age, so for a 30-year-old male, we would say, I need the table is in the book. Really, I could estimate it. 56 would put you in the top 2.5%.
And that means that I'm...
Oh, sorry. What's that number mean?
Yeah.
That's 56 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body weight per minute.
Okay. So a high
How much do you weigh?
None of your business. I'm joking.
How many kilos?
I think I'm 96 kilograms at the moment.
Okay.
I'm very heavy.
So you would need to be 5.3, 5.4, 5.5 liters. Yeah. No. Yeah. You'd need to be about 5.5 liters per minute. You would need to consume 5.5 liters of oxygen per minute to come out to about a VO2 max of 56 or 57 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. That would put you at the top 2.5% for your age and sex.
So I'm trying to figure out, is taking more oxygen from the air that I breathe a sign of good health?
Yes. It means it speaks to how fast and hard your heart can pump,
yeah,
and how good your muscles are at utilizing oxygen.
Okay.
It is the most important metric we have for peak cardiorespiratory fitness.
And sorry if we're getting a bit narrow here, because I really want to understand this, and I'm sure there's a lot of people that sat trying to understand this as well. So what are the things that stand in the way of good VO2 max? In terms of and also the lungs.
Yeah, it turns out that not much of it is limited by the lungs. So the question is, where are you limited? Okay, so how does this test work? Do you prefer to run or bike?
I prefer to bike.
Okay, so we're going to put you on a bike. We're going to put this mask on your face that allows no other air in or out. It's only going to be metered by what's coming from the machine. The bike is going to be one that has forced resistance to it. It's called an ergometer. So we're going to set it to 100 watts, nice and easy. I'm going to tell you to warm up for a while. And then after a 10-minute warm up, it's going to start increasing the power that you're forced to pedal against.
Okay.
And every 2 minutes, we're going to add some amount, 25 or 50 watts. And you're going to say you have to stay above about 70 RPM.
Mm-hmm.
And this test is going to go until you can't do it anymore. It's going to go till you basically drop. So what's limiting you is clearly not the amount of oxygen in the air. And it's actually not the ability of your lungs to get oxygen into your blood. You're limited by how hard and fast your heart can pump that blood through your body and how efficient your muscles are at taking the oxygen out and using it. And the difference between, so again, a 30-year-old who's in the top 2.5% of their age group might be at 56, 57. But to put that in context, the guy who wins the Tour de France this year is 85.
Wow.
And by the way, when that number reaches 20, or certainly 18, 19, you have a hard time just getting around. Like, you wouldn't be able to walk up a flight of stairs. So that gives you a sense of the gradient. Now, let's get to my point that answers your question. You asked, how can I say exercise is so powerful? Well, what do you think is the hazard ratio when I compare someone at the top 2.5% to someone at the bottom 25%?
In terms of VO2 max?
Yes.
Top 2% versus the bottom 25. Bottom 25%, that's quite big. top 2% is quite narrow. I'd say 1.5, which is what, 50%?
So you think it's less important than strength? Because we've just established for strength, it's about 3.
So I'm increasing it now because I was so wrong on strength.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? Well, what would I have said had you not told me the strength one? So,
by the way, I think your guess is a completely reasonable guess because the answer is so absurd.
I'm going to say 1.5 hazard ratio.
It's 5.
5. So
which means 400% difference in all-cause mortality.
If you
when you compare the fittest 2.5% to the least fit 25%.
Wow, so it makes a huge difference.
So this is why I can say with absolute certainty, nothing compares to exercise. Nothing compares to having a high VO2 max, high muscle mass, and high muscle strength. They are more beneficial for you than any bad thing you can think of is bad for you.
Why is the muscle mass piece so important and the strength piece? Why is that causing me to stay alive?
I think there are several reasons. As you get, so there's, I put them in 2 buckets, structural and metabolic. Let's start with the latter. Muscles are where you dispose of glucose. So glucose regulation is one of the most important metabolic functions of the body. Our ability to metabolize glucose and regulate glucose levels is central to our existence on this planet. And when we get it just a little bit wrong, we go to hell in a handbasket. That's what type 2 diabetes is. Type 2 diabetes, raging type 2 diabetes, only means you have an extra 5 grams of blood sugar, 1 teaspoon in your circulation. That's it. The difference between you and someone with type 2 diabetes so bad that they're going to get their digits amputated is an extra 1 teaspoon of glucose in the bloodstream. That's how critical it is that we regulate our blood sugar. And the most important part of blood sugar regulation is having muscles that are big enough to put the glucose into and that are insulin sensitive enough to respond to the signal of insulin.
And glucose is stored in just a couple of places in our body, right?
It's only stored in the liver and in the muscles, but the muscles store 80% of it.
Okay, so muscles are really, really good for glucose regulation because it gives the sugar more place to hide.
That's right. So the other reason muscle mass and strength is so important is as we age, fragility and frailty become an enormous liability in death. There's a figure in that book that shows the mortality associated with falling. And it becomes catastrophic once you hit the age of 65. Once you hit the age of 65, if you fall, which is pretty likely, and you break your hip or your femur, the long bone in your leg, there's a 15 to 30% chance you will be dead within the next 12 months.
Really?
Yes. It's insane.
Because you become sedentary.
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for it, but certainly a loss of function is a big one. You can also just die as a result of hitting your head. Yeah. You can die from a fat embolism or a blood clot. You can die from sepsis. You can die from, a heart attack because there's so many things that can kind of kill you in response to it. But even the people, the 70 to 85% of people who don't die, 50% of them will experience a significant loss of function that never recovers after. So this issue of sarcopenia, which is loss of muscle mass, and frailty and fragility become the absolute keeper of death for people once they reach the 7th decade of life. Again, if you're 30 years old, it's impossible to fathom this stuff because you're indestructible.
Yeah.
Even at my age, I feel indestructible and I'm 50, but this changes and we have to do all we can to ward it off.